And the webinar is going to start now. So Vivian, you're on.
Welcome to Conversations with Go On Girl Book Club, a discussion series with authors about their literary works. Go On Girl is a national book club that celebrates, perpetuates, curates, and preserves the gift of reading, of human expression using words, the art of Black literature. Across 3 decades, our mission as a book club has been to celebrate the legacy of Black literature, foster a sisterhood rooted in the love of literature, and encourage the development of literary talent. We have 48 chapters in 18 states and 38 cities with nearly 400 members. Please check us out on our website at goongirl.org. I am Vivian Phillips' husband, the chair and president of Go On Girl Book Club. And this evening, we are so pleased to be in conversation with Dolen Perkins Valdez, author of our June reading list selection, Take My Hand. Our moderator for this episode of Conversations with Go On Girl is Candace Banks, from our Georgia 3 chapter. Candace, shall we start?
Yes. Hello. Thanks again, and welcome to Conversation with our author, Dolen Perkins Valdez. We are so ready to talk about Take My Hand. And I just want to give my personal first, take on it. I loved this book. I think about chapter 4, I was like, okay, wait a minute, I'm not going to be able to do it. But of course, I kept going and it just got better and better. I'm a historical fiction girl. I just loved it. So just have to let you know that. Welcome, Dolen.
Thank you.
And I'll give it just a little background. If someone here isn't quite familiar with you, you are a New York Times bestselling author, got 2 books already, Quench and Bomb, and of course, Take My Hand, all of the awards. Recently, the American Bar Association awarded Take My Hand for its prestigious Silver Gavel Award and recognizes an outstanding work that fosters the American public understanding of law and the legal system. So important. And so you have also established yourself as a premier American historical life chronicle. You are telling our stories, especially as Black women in America, and we thank you for that. And so I just want to get into it. All of the readers here are really excited. And let's just talk about historical fiction a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about your writing style with that, the research that it takes, and especially with Take My Hand, because this is, as you say, inspired by real life people who are actually still living. So can you talk about that process?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm so excited to be here, and I've admired Go On Girl for a long time and love the work that y'all do. So I'm really excited to be here tonight. And I think, the thing I will say first about my philosophy of historical fiction is that I believe in the imagination first, right? Like, I'm not a journalist, I'm not an academic, I'm not a historian. I fancy myself an armchair historian, but I'm not a trained historian, and I'm not writing to sort of speak to the historical record. So I would say that my approach to historical fiction is that I really value the fiction part of that phrase and what I can do to add to what's already there. And I think Black history provides a really unique opportunity for somebody like me and other historical fiction writers of our experience to come along and imagine what might have happened, particularly when there are gaps in the historical record, which there so often are with Black historical research and archival records. So, but I do have to do a lot of research just to even know where those gaps are. So for this book, I looked through a lot of newspapers. You mentioned people are still living. I talked to people. I flew down to Montgomery. I rented a car and I drove around the city looking at a map, looking at a contemporary map, but also looking at a 1973 map, an old map, so I can see what the city looked like, what the city limits looked like back then. I even listened to recordings of people from Montgomery so that I could get a feel for the accent, the dialect, even though I'm very dialect light, I would say, with my depiction of Southern speech. I do want to sort of have a little bit of accuracy, and I don't always get it perfect, but I do listen to people, recordings of people from that area. And then the final thing I do is I look at any pictures that I can find. I looked at pictures of the actual clinic that existed. I looked at pictures of the old Kmart. I looked at pictures that I could find of some of the impoverished rural neighborhoods right outside of Montgomery. Yeah, it's a multifaceted process for sure.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about the characters. There is a big cast of characters in this novel. And, I can't say that I actually hated anybody. I had some favorites. So I want to talk about the characters, whether it's, Civil, Alicia, of course, India and Erica, Mace, one of my favorites, Ty, and even Lou Feldman. Were those characters derived, especially like Civil, who's the nurse? Can you talk about imagining her, because she wasn't actually highlighted in the true story?
Right. Well, I'll say that, I've written 3 books that had women at the center. This is Civil. In the previous book, it was Madge. And the book before that, it was Lizzie. And all 3 of them are young. And all 3 of them are a facet of my young self, I would say, right? Like all 3 of my protagonists are very smart, but they can make some bad decisions, which is, me at 23 years old. And so I will say that, like, first and foremost, I put a lot of my young self in there. But Civil in particular is my imagining of what it would have been like to be a nurse at that clinic. But she was also really inspired by the social worker, Mrs. Jessie Bly, who I met with and I talked to, and who was so instrumental in taking the case and getting it in front of the lawyers so that justice would be done. So Civil is sort of a mixture of me, Jessie Bly, and the nurse who I never was able to uncover in my research.
Wow. Okay. I had another question. As far as Miss Eager, I think it's how you pronounce her name, was she based on, I think it's Margaret Sager, who's this kind of American woman who was all about American reproductive policy way back when? The name is similar. I just wondered if you were inspired by her with that character.
No, she's not related to Sanger. She is a sort of my fictionalized portrayal of the woman who was the actual supervising nurse at the clinic at the time, and she's deceased now. But there were moments, really several moments in the newspapers that I found, were interviews with her, and I think her real name was Dixon.
Okay.
And she was just my own exploration of how a white woman at that time would have thought she was doing good, but was actually doing quite a bit of harm.
Yeah, yeah. And as far as the girls or the women now, they're grown women. So India and Erica, you have since met the real Ralph sisters. What was your interpretation, or do you think you really brought them to life as far as their personality with the characters?
Well, it's funny because I did not interview the real life Ralph sisters while I was researching this book. I made really, in my mind, an ethical decision that I was not going to go in. The sisters were senior citizens, they were living in public housing. And in my mind, everybody that was writing something about their story didn't need to go knocking on their door, interviewing them. And I didn't think my book was any more special than anybody else's account. So I was just fine with, them knowing that I was writing it, and and them not having any objection to that. But after I met them, they are like family to me now. They're like my sisters. They are remarkable women, national heroines in my mind and in my view. And I just hope that I did them justice. I hope that I honored their story. And I can say that my girls, India and Erica, are real, true products of my imagination. But they, but I hope that I just hope that I did the sisters justice, because they're remarkable.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I'll be honest, I didn't know the story prior to the book. I had heard about the Tuskegee experiment being in Alabama, knew some history around that, but I had never heard about these sisters. So again, it was the bigger shock in reading this fictional novel that, oh my gosh, this really happened. So I would just say you really did bring the entire story to life. And I would say a greater awareness of that story and how we can possibly still help now. So that's greatly to be applauded.
Thank you.
So let's go into some of the different themes in this book.
Okay.
I have a lot of them listed. Maybe the group will have some in the chat, but you mentioned that's what some of your other books, women, Black women at the center. But I especially think here it's the sisterhood of women. There's this sisterhood of like the blood sister, with the sisters, India and Erica. It was this sisterhood of the new Black nurses in these family planning centers. The relationship with Civil and Alicia. Can you talk about your ideas around sisterhood?
It's interesting because, for me, I mean, particularly if we're talking about India and Erica, or even Civil and Alicia, for me, the Black women's sisterhood is not even something I have to create. It just is. It's like the fabric, right? It's like I can't imagine myself without my girlfriends, and I don't even know who I am without my sisters, both biological and, not biological. And so I don't exist outside of that, So when people ask me that question, it's not something that I consciously, craft, as much as it is, if you're gonna have a Black woman character, this is what it's gonna look like, right? Like, she's gonna have a girlfriend, or she's gonna have a sister, or she's gonna have, in my second book, she had 4 aunts like I do, who had all these dynamics going, or 3 aunts. I can't remember how many, but I have 4. So, I think it's how a lot of us process things. It's how I make sense of the world. It's and my girls are who I go to when I am, distraught. I have 2 daughters, and in my family, like, I just say to them, like, I hope y'all get along when you get older and you don't fight so much, and I hope they will. But, in my family, the women in my family are pretty strong. So what I try to do, and of course, in real life, Minnie Lee and Mary Alice Ralph still live together. They do. And so it's a source of strength for us. And I don't consciously put that in my book. I don't think like, oh, I'm going to give her a friend or a sidekick, like how Hollywood thinks of it. Like, I wrote that chapter, and there was a girl in the class with her name Alicia, and Alicia was kind of a smart aleck and, kind of sassy, but also kind of country, and they kind of bonded, and the next thing you know, they're friends for life.
Yeah, yeah, and I love that it's kind of a flashback as Sybil's telling the story. So it's good to see they were still friends and in connection
Yeah,
later in age. That was really wonderful to see. You also mentioned something else. Another thing that I looked at throughout the novel was mother-daughter relationship. So, Sybil and her mother had this dynamic relationship, especially what I would say that Sybil's mother was dealing with some mental health. So what is that like with having a mother that's dealing with mental health issues? Again, with Erica and India, who had lost a mom. So what does that look like? And being with the grandmother and being in society, right? Even Miss Seeger and her daughter, who, when Sybil goes back, she has that talk, this relationship that I felt like her daughter was so concerned, like, well, my mom was good. My mom was a good person. Can you speak about the mother-daughter relationships in the book?
Yeah. It's interesting because, someone recently said to me that Black writers were really starting to delve into the difficulties of the mother-daughter relationship for Black women. And I think to myself, wasn't Toni Morrison already doing that back in 1970 something? Like, we've always been honest, I think, about the multifacetedness of what it means to be a Black woman in the South, right? I mean,
Yeah.
even if we go back to Zora Neale Hurston, right? We can go all the way back. It's only in these popular caricatures where Black Southern women were seen as these sort of fountains of wisdom and, care and nurturing and, able to sort of move mountains and all of these
Yeah.
things. But I feel like in the Black literary tradition, we've always been kind of honest. I mean, even if you think about television, think about some of the older Black women characters on Black shows that had Black writers. So I think that in the book, I'm writing this mother character. At first, she's just sort of eccentric. I know she's an artist. She's middle class, so she has a little bit of a different sensibility. And then one day I'm drafting the manuscript and she sleeps overnight in the studio. And I'm like, wow, what's going on with that? And that was when I started to realize that she might have some mental health challenges. And I just went with it. And, I'm just open when I write to my characters surprising me. And I think when you're open to that, you'll get characters that have flesh on the bones,
Yeah.
And she's got this Aunt Roz who, reminds me a little bit of some of my aunts. I had, like, my mother was one of 5 girls. And so I had 4 aunts, and everybody was different, but a lot of us had in the South that one aunt who knew all of the things about, the new talk therapy and, getting therapy and burning sage. And they were vegetarians before anybody in the South was a vegetarian. And they had a afro and they wore caftans and they smoked cigarettes and drank a lot of coffee. But they were truth tellers. They were like the truth tellers of the family. And this is her Aunt Ross to me. She's like, do y'all see what I'm seeing? That my sister here is crumbling and we need to do something to support her. And so I just tried to capture. And then you've got also Ty's mom, who's a lawyer, one of the early Black lawyers in Montgomery. There weren't a whole lot of them. I looked it up. It was very few. And you've got her, and she, has to make this choice between which case she's going to work on. And she also has these plants that she cares for. And the plants to me are sort of a metaphor of how she's caretaking. So I think, what I tried to do with the mother-daughter relationships, I didn't try to like make a statement as much as I just tried to like follow where the characters were leading me and being open to them leading me somewhere that might be a little dark.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that even with, you know, with Sybil and her dad, educated healthcare professionals, they still didn't necessarily have the language around like what it was, like, it wasn't quite named, which we actually see, I think, in families. It's kind of a said, unsaid thing. I thought that was really true, the way that you handled that with those characters. Can you talk about placing, because when we talk about Sybil's family, they were, I would assume, they describe kind of upper middle class. So you brought in these dynamics of classism within the Black community, because there was such a difference between the Williams family and the Townsend, the Rollins. Can you talk about entering that into the novel?
Yes, years ago, the writer Randall Keenan, the late writer, who was my friend and mentor, said to me, "You ought to write about Black class dynamics in the South." And I thought, but I never had that book. I never had that story. And when I started writing this book, I realized it had to be the book Randall had wanted me to write, because, if just the very fact that she's trained as a nurse puts her in a completely different position than the Williams family. And so I decided to just accentuate that by having her be the daughter of a doctor and an artist, and having her live in this established Black neighborhood in Montgomery, and having her be a graduate of Tuskegee Nursing School, which was a very prestigious degree to hold. And still is. I just wanted her to have to grapple with some things, right? And again, putting myself in that position, because I grew up middle class and Black in the South, but it didn't mean that, I was completely cocooned, right? Like, everybody has a cousin that, has been on public assistance, et cetera. Black families are diverse,
Yes.
socioeconomically diverse Black families. And so I wanted her to, have to grapple with some things, have to think about some things. And like I say, I put myself a lot in Sybil, and Sybil's daddy reminds me of my daddy, because at one point, he tells Sybil, "When you get to those people's house, don't get out the car." And she says, "But Daddy, how am I supposed to do my job if I don't get out the car?" And he doesn't answer. And that sounded exactly like something my daddy would say, something that didn't make any sense, And I wanted, but he's trying to protect her, but at the same time, he can't. He can't.
Yeah. And I think that rolls into another theme. Because Sybil was so nice. She was so kind. I think her intention was so good, right? And then it's like, oh, wait a minute. Is Sybil this savior character? Is she advocating for these girls? Is she going beyond certain boundaries? The intention I think was great and good, but what and which, so often when we hear about the savior, we hear about the white savior, and especially in historical fiction, right? Or in movies, it's this white savior trope that we don't want to see. But I think it was so good or different to see, what is this that Sybil's doing? And if you consider it, was she advocating, or was she almost playing this savior role?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Because so often that is in the context of white people, right? And in the classic To Kill a Mockingbird, which is, to me, the sort of classic American white savior story. And in some ways, this book complicates that model, because it suggests that also there's an element of class in that. And, I didn't just put Sybil into this as a Black woman. I read in a newspaper that head nurse, who was a white woman, defended the actions of the clinic by saying that all of the nurses who worked at the clinic were Black. And that was when I was intrigued enough to say, well, who were they? Who were those women who worked at the clinic? So it allows us to think about the savior question outside of the context of racism, right? So let's
Yes.
talk about this. Let's talk about what it means to be a savior, period.
Yeah.
And let's
Yeah.
talk about the difference between advocacy and crossing a line. Let's talk about that, and so this is kind of the question I was asking and pushing at throughout the book had to do with how do we, because some people say, well, what's the answer to this? Is it that we don't help people? And the answer, of course, is not that we don't, it's not, of course we help people. What kind of world would we live in if we didn't help people in need, but part of what the book I think is sort of suggesting is that people are people. They have agency. They are humans. They have their own minds. We have to, it has to be a dialogue. We have to talk to them. We have to know what they need from us instead of us just doing, right? When we have a community organization, we have to put people from that community on the board, on the
Yes.
staff. You see some of these community organizations have nobody from the community involved. How are you doing that? It's like you need to have people from the community who are actually affected by the issues that you're trying to repair in the conversation. Because, I know some people say, well, some patients, don't know, like doctors will say, well, like some patients, I can't get them to take their medicine or what have you. But, and we know that's true. There are people like that, but there are also people who do take their medicine and who do have an opinion about what their community needs and who do want good health care and who are informed. Again, going back to Aunt Roz, in the community where I was growing up, you couldn't go 2 houses without stumbling on somebody with either a degree or who was self-educated. That was a big thing too in my community. People were self-educated. Self-educated was something real. That wasn't just somebody spewing off some nonsense. That was somebody who had actually learned some things, through life and through reading the paper and watching TV. So part of what I'm trying to say about that savior thing is, let's think very carefully about our relationship to the communities that we serve.
Yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful. I still don't know if I have an answer. I think I was team Sybil. She was just trying to help, but I did enjoy the grandmother kind of getting her together at the end to say, hey, you know what? We're moving on. You have done us well. Thank you. But, we have our own life to live. So I don't know. I think she was advocating. Okay. This novel does also tackle some very heavy topics, right? When we're talking about sterilization, reproductive health, I would even say, Black maternal health. And I think also with the release of this book last year, we have to bring up Roe versus Wade overturning, right? So all of this is almost like the perfect little storm, perfect mix of the topic and theme of this book, and also what was happening in real time in our day and age, right? So can you talk about that and how you felt about that last year?
Yeah, it's interesting because I always remind people that I started this book 7 years ago. Well, it's been since 2016, so that was 7 years ago, 3 Supreme Court justices ago. So in no way did I think that 2 months after this book came out, Roe v. Wade would be overturned. That was the furthest thing from my mind. Even when I, was drafting the novel and made the decision that Sybil was going to terminate a pregnancy or had terminated a pregnancy, it had nothing to do with Roe v. Wade, like it was completely in the context of me trying to figure out why Sybil was so devastated and so emotionally distraught. but when the decision happened, I recognized that this book was a conduit through which we could have some really serious conversations about, bodily autonomy.
Mhm.
And, really reminding people that when we talk about bodily autonomy, we're not just talking about the decision to terminate a pregnancy. We're also talking about a woman's right to have a baby if she wants to. And the two are connected. And so I think when the Dobbs decision happened last summer, some women were thinking, well, how does this affect me? Either they were thinking, I'm not of childbearing age, or I want more children. I would never terminate a pregnancy. And so part of what I was trying to suggest or have a conversation about was, well, I think there may be ways in which all of us might be affected by this decision, not just those of us who seek abortion care, but those of us who also, want to have children, or who are going through IVF, or who have had miscarriages and need to get a DNC in a medical facility, or who have nieces or daughters or cousins, or who may at some point have fibroids or need a hysterectomy. Like, these are real issues, and they're all connected to the Dobbs decision. And so once that happened, I just began to really understand that this was something bigger than this book, this story. It was really just bigger than me. Is really
Yeah,
what
yeah.
I'm
And I thought, because I read your first book, and
Uh-huh.
when you talk about body autonomy, I think back in Winch, where with Liz or Lizzie, she didn't have that body, where she was tired of having her master's babies, right? And so she didn't have that choice back then. In fact, I hope I'm not telling it. If you haven't, go back and read Winch. But that last baby that she terminated, right? And under the guise of drinking the tea. But the first three was because he told her to, right? And so it's actually, I think, a really good arc between your first novel and this one, where we have, and again, this is under whiteness, really, I think both times, from a master's perspective, saying, hey, you're going to have my baby, to take my hand. And now we're having a conversation of, we have whiteness, or the government saying, hey, you don't deserve to have kids. You're not worthy of that. I think that's an amazing arc between these two novels.
That's interesting, because I mean, what we're basically doing right now is drawing a parallel between lack of abortion care and slavery, right? And I think there is a link to be drawn there, because we all know that the greatest impact of slavery to enslaved women was reproductive control, right? And so not only the control of our bodies in terms of pregnancies, unwanted rape, etc., but also the control of the condition of our children, right? Because our children were then enslaved. So I definitely feel that there are still conversations to be had. There's still so much as women in this country we have to talk about and process. And we need to be talking to the young women out there, because this is a conversation that is going to go on over a generation.
Yeah.
And they just need to be equipped, informed, educated, and empowered, so that the encroachment on their bodies does not continue.
Yeah. Wow. Powerful. So we have lots of members here. Guys, please come into the chat, ask your questions. I can chit chat all night, but we want to hear from everyone. So let's please get some questions in the chat. Let me open up my chat, see if I missed anything. Let's see here. Oh, well, there's a comment that we had here from our president. I'll read it. It says, aside from the abortion happening to Black girls, it seemed that Civil was most bothered by the choice or lack thereof, given the decision she made for herself and the unresolved feelings about that decision. It wasn't so much about abortion is wrong, but rather a matter of choice. Great comment. Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Okay. We have a lot of members from all around. Okay. So questions. I'm going to look at my notes here.
I see a question here in the Q&A.
Oh, I don't have the, oh, there we go. What was your thought about having the youngest child be mute?
Oh, okay. That's real. In real life, the younger Ralph's sister is nonverbal. And I did not want to change that because it's part of the beauty of her. But once I decided that I would not change that, and my readers had a hold of my manuscript, they began to ask me questions about, like, would the clinic have been concerned that she could have been violated and wouldn't be able to communicate? Wouldn't they have been concerned about her ability to raise a child? Like, it meant that I needed to do my research on disability and how to, depict a disabled character with honor and in integrity and with a sense of authority. Like, I asked people who were disability studies professors to give me advice on how best to portray her. And I also really focused on who she was as a little girl. And so rather than the disability, because she was a whole person,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question here. Did you interview any nurses who worked during that time period in different states to talk about similar experiences they may have witnessed?
No, I did not. That's a good question. Maybe I should have done that. I would say that when I find a silence in the archive, and here I could not find the nurses and I couldn't find any accounts from the nurses, that's when my imagination goes crazy. And that's actually sort of when I stopped researching. There's a great interview with Toni Morrison when she's talking about how she came up with the idea for Beloved. She said she found this newspaper article about the real life woman, Margaret Garner, who had murdered her baby rather than let the baby be returned to slavery. And she said, as soon as she read that article, she put it aside and started writing, and just not wanting to tell a true story, but rather to imagine a story around this inspiration of Margaret Garner. And I think I do that a little bit too. Like, when I reach a certain point in my research where I think I need to just see where my mind takes me. And then if there's anything else I need, I'll go back and research. But I try not to over research as a historical fiction writer, because then the story gets a little clunky, because then you're like trying to fit the story into what, you know what I mean? So, but I do like that idea of, like, I didn't even think about like interviewing other like nurses who had done home visits in those rural areas in Alabama. I like that idea.
Yeah.
That would have been
Good.
something just interesting to talk to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that at that time it was happening all around the country.
Yes.
So it was nationwide. Okay, we have another question. Tell us more about the title of the book.
So what was my original title? The Takings was my original title. And it is from a clause in the Constitution that is often used for constitutional lawyers who argue for reparations. It's called the Takings Clause. And still, it suggests that, Black bodies were basically taken for public use without just compensation, and that we should be compensated for the use of our labor. And so there's that scene in the book where Mrs. Williams, the grandmother, says, all they do is take.
Mm,
And that was
okay.
a reference to the Takings Clause. But my publisher did not like that title. My agent did not like that title. Nobody liked it. They thought it was going to be too, like, I don't know, too whatever. People wouldn't get it, blah, 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 blah. So we started brainstorming, and I still wanted something. I wanted something Southern. I
Mhm.
wanted something that really captured Montgomery and that moment, that sort of post-civil rights movement era moment. And my publisher, Craig Burke, came up with that title, and he said, what do you think about Take My Hand? And I thought, oh yeah, from Precious Lord, Take My Hand. And I looked at the story of the songwriter. I looked it up, Googled Thomas Dorsey, who had written it after his wife died. And, I looked at the lyrics more closely, all the different verses. And I slept on it. And then the next morning, I said to my editor, I said, I kind of like that title. And she said, I do too. We'll come back to it. And we kept brainstorming. And a few days later, we came back to it again. And I said, I kind of like that, Take My Hand. And she said, me too. And then I found out that it was Martin Luther King's Precious Lord, Take My Hand was his favorite song. And reportedly,
Wow.
his last words were to his musician Ben to play it at the meeting that night and play it real
Wow.
pretty.
Yeah.
So I thought, that's it. That's the title. And everybody on your team has to agree. Everybody agreed. And yeah, for my first book signing for the book, my niece sang the song. I'll put it on tomorrow. I'll put it on Instagram.
Oh, thanks.
So
That's
y'all
so
look at my
beautiful.
Instagram
Yeah.
tomorrow. She sang it beautifully a cappella, and she surprised me.
Oh, wow. That's so touching. I'd have been in tears probably.
Yes, and she can really sing. So I was like, oh, my niece. I could barely contain myself. I was so proud of her.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Another question, comment here. And again, I had a question about this, and then also our president has a comment. I'll read a little bit of it. Sybil had strange relationships with men. Did you attempt to make the men in her life with similar characteristics as her father? What drew her to these men?
Yeah, she's only 23, y'all. And I say, and that's why I say it's a little bit of me and her. So she's attracted to Mace because he's older. He's one of those, good old-fashioned, good-looking country men. And ain't nothing like him. I mean, anybody that's ever spent any time in the Deep South knows that there's just nothing like him, and she's attracted to that. But it's not an appropriate relationship because she is, a government worker who's providing for the family, and she holds a position of power. And she knows that, but she's young and she flirts and she's foolish. Ty, she grew up with parents, were good friends, and she sees him as a brother, but really he's the love of her life, but she has a hard time breaking out of that he's like a brother thing. And they date, and then when the pregnancy happens, she just doesn't deal with it well. And so that moment passes them by,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then yeah.
Well, in Georgia 3, we were all caught up in it. It's a book with, very important topics. It's heavy, but there's a little smidgen of romance. And I should say me, was rooting for Sybil and Mace just a tad bit. I wasn't quite sure the age difference, but I like them together. And we have this question where we say, who would play these characters in a movie? and we saw Mace being Kofi. He plays Ralph Angel in what is the show on OWN? I can't think of the name now, but that's who he was in our club. So, ladies, who did you guys say Mace was, or any of the male characters? You can put it in the chat. So we just had that question around the men in the book. Queen Sugar, thank you. Yes. Okay, we have another question. Why did Sybil wait so many years before returning to visit India and Erica?
Well, she moves out of the state. She goes to med school, and she kind of goes on with her life, and just kind of loses touch with them, and tries to put it behind her, even though she's not really. I've heard Michael Ealy, y'all. Somebody said the eyes. She tries to put it behind her, but she can't really, and she knows that she's got to go back. I think she honestly is a little afraid to go back, because she kind of blames herself for not protecting them. And also, remember, the family tells her to move on. Like Mrs. Williams says to her, you need to move on with your life. And I don't want to say like, I mean, she's pretty firm, and it hurts Sybil, but she basically says, we need to move on. I need to move on with the girls and with Mace, and you need to move on, because we're stuck in this, cycle right now. And so she also sort of honoring Mrs. Williams' wishes to kind of leave them alone.
Yeah, that was good. But I liked how she felt, she always carried them with her. She talks about having their names stitched into her white jacket. I thought that was really nice and sweet as well. And I think it changed her life. I mean, I think it pushed her to live her best life, right? She went on to become a doctor and fulfill so many other dreams, perhaps. Let's see here. Questions. Oh, somebody else said Terrence Howard. Okay. All right. We had some good characters here. Okay. One more question. I think we really want to, can you give us an update? What's currently going on with the Ralph sisters? Did they ever receive any true monetary, say reparations? Did they get justice? Where are they now? What's going on?
Well, I would say they are doing great. They are still in Montgomery. They did not get any money at all. Up until last year, they were still living in public housing, but they are now in their first home, and they are in their late 60s. They call me all the time. They're delightful. They were, there were 6 Ralphs. In my book, there's only the sisters, but there were 6. So they have their brothers, and they have a sister, Katie, who's also still alive. So they're surrounded by family and love. They've got pictures of children. Of course, they don't have children, but they have pictures of children throughout their house, nieces, nephews, godchildren. So they did have the joy of children in terms of extended family. Minnie told me the last time I was there that she was reading this book, and that she loved it, and that she was taking her time and reading a little bit each night.
Oh, beautiful.
And Mary Alice, her sister-in-law, gave her a boom box and some headphones, and she loves to listen to blues music. And she sits at the dining room table with her headphones on and just kind of rocks and listens to her blues.
Wow.
And while I was there, we watched a Tyler Perry movie together, and they're just in my mind, being with them is like being with angels on earth. They're really special people.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. So what can we expect next from you? Are you working on anything? Something
I
coming
am working on
soon?
something and it's due in December, which means it won't be out until early 2025.
Okay.
So, it's going to be a little while, but in the meantime, I encourage everybody to support Black writers, continue, because I know y'all already do, but continue to support Black writers, continue to do what you're doing. It really helps to keep things going in the pipeline for all of us. It's great to give a book as a gift. You just never know who you might ignite a passion for reading for. So give books as gifts, even to, so-called non-readers, even though I don't think there's anything such as a non-reader, because people also can listen to audiobooks. And I'm part of a large network and community of writers. And so by supporting them, you support me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we will continue to support, and there's just a little chat here about the Audible version. I also did the Audible version of this, and I loved it. And there may have been a question about that. I think, did you select the narrator for it?
I didn't, because they wrote me and they said, we're trying to get Lauren Daggett, wish us luck. So I was like, okay, like, who is this Lauren Daggett? But when I heard her, I was blown away. She's awesome. I've been in touch with her and she's a beautiful person. She says she loved the book. I think Audible named it one of the top 10 audiobook narrations in 2022. I could not have done it myself better. I wish Lauren would do every book for me. She's awesome. And I agree. And everybody tells me that she's really good. And my audiobook sales have been really unusually high. And I think it's due to her. Yeah.
It's wonderful when you talk about the dialect and, it's not overly, but she got it right. I would agree. I'm from the South. So, I thought it was right on. Lots of love here for your work.
Thank y'all. Thank
for
you.
the Audible. Yeah. So anything else you want to share with us?
No, this has just been so great. And thank you, Candace. I know it's a lot of work to prep for one of these. So I want to just say thank you for the good questions. Thank you for everybody that took some time out on a Thursday night. I'm just, grateful.
Okay. Well, do we have any last words from the president?
No, I've just enjoyed this so much. I'm so honored. Thank you so much, Dolen, for coming to be a part of Conversations with Go On Girl. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Thank you.
Right. Yes. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Vivian.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Night.